Hello, I'm Matteo Bautista, and welcome to my Festival of Data. This Festival of Data will be focused on an article in the Chicago Sun-Times that focuses on the recent snowfall in Chicago. So I'll start sharing. Um, so the Festival of Data, Chicago snowfall. Now, where they got their data was from the Chicago O'Hare International Airport, located in like the northwestern region of Chicago. It's where the National Weather Service is located, or one of the locations to collect weather data for Chicago and surrounding areas. So this is where pretty much like most of the data has, or not most, all of the data had come from for this specific article. So the data was used to create two different graphs. This was the first graph, which is a form of like a bar chart. Um, and it was kind of used to uh, pretty much just show and compare the amount of snowfall that had been in the area compared to other times which had comparable snowfall. So the article's focus was actually on the number of consecutive days where there was at least 10 inches of snow on the ground. So in 2021, there was 25 days consecutively where Chicago had at least 10 inches of snow on the ground. Not necessarily that it gained overnight or anything, but just that there was at least 10 inches of snow for these 25 days. Um, and compared to like other instances, like say for instance in 1979 with the longest stretch of 48 days, 1918 with following with 37, then 2001 with 31 days, and then in fifth place is 1885 with 16 days. This was the second chart that they used, a form of a line graph, although with the area below, kind of like the lines filled in, kind of just I think just more for like a visual presentation, kind of just to give a better idea of just like this is like how much there was kind of thing to give an idea of mass kind of. So yeah, this is the top four times where there was at least 10 inches of snow for days consecutively. Where the top left is 2021, which shows that over the 25 days that there was, well, at least 10 inches of snow, starting at the end of January-ish to slash beginning of February. And then in 2001, where there was 31 days, where it was spread between middle of December to like middle of January-ish for about a month, almost exactly. And then in 1918, with 37 days spread out around actually somewhat similar time, a little bit earlier than the 2021 area, but around the similar time of beginning slash middle-ish of January to the beginning slash middle of February. And finally, the record-breaking time with 48 days in a row of at least 10 inches of snow, which spread from like the middle of January all the way through February into like just like the beginning of March. So for 48 days. And it looks like for a lot of that, there was at least 20 inches of snow. So it also does a good job of comparing kind of just like how much snow there was in the beginning. And it seems like in 1979, there was, well, a lot of snow. And I think that having that sort of the filled in area below the lines kind of does give a better visual representation of like where the where the audience can kind of look at this graph and kind of have an idea of like how much mass there is, how like the massive amount of snow. Because if it was just lines, it would be. I don't think it would be as visually gripping, or as kind of just like representative of the amount of the mass. So, yeah, the analysis that was really done by the reporter in this article was on the how it was a significantly or a significant historic time over these past few days this year for in terms of weather in Chicago, and that although like there was like times where people were having to kind of like shovel out their cars and kind of just dealing with all this snow and kind of just thinking like why like how is this so much snow, that this was in a sense like an outlier compared to other instances that realistically, there's only been a handful of times that we've had that much snow for so long in Chicago. Um, and that, yeah, that although it was a lot, like say comparing it to like the highest outlier, the record-breaking time in 1979, it was just a little bit more than half the amount of time that that was. So although it was kind of like crazy, it wasn't like the craziest that had ever been, like the craziest like amount of snow. Um, Whereas like even like compared to like the fifth time, or like the fifth highest amount of days with at least 10 inches of snow or more, it was like 1.5 times as big as that time in 1885. So again, a good comparison, I think, to kind of like put that into context and perspective of showing that although it wasn't the most amount of days, or that there wasn't the most amount of days that people had to deal with it, that it was definitely still comparable, and a great outlier compared to even, like I said, the fifth place time in 1885, and probably in other years and other instances where with snowfall. Um, and then with this line graph, it gives a good, like I was talking about earlier, touched upon a good visual representation of kind of just like the amount of snow there was, like a good way of visualizing the amount of snow, and kind of like having that time of like, or that representation of like time passing, of like this, of how there was this much snow and how it kind of kept decreasing um, over time, or kind of increased. And that it does show that although, like I said, that there was a lot of snow in this period of time, that it wasn't as much as like I said, the record-breaking times. That if you were to kind of like give an idea of like the area underneath the lines, this visual representation really does show like, yes, this was a lot, but compared to like 1979, it really just almost looks like a quarter of the amount of like snow. If you were to kind of like take it into, granted, it's probably not a perfect like representation, but it really does look like it was just like a quarter of the amount of snow that stayed for that amount of time. But again, it's important to state just like comparing it to like the fifth place time, although they don't have it in this in the other line graphs, they don't have the 18 1885 time date or period. That it would roughly be a little bit more than half, about like 3/4 of the 25-day one. And even then, maybe not even as much as there was here. So again, put it into context, it really showed that it was a historic time in Chicago weather. Some of the biggest challenges would be kind of just, and I think what I touched upon already, is putting all this data together and putting it into context. Kind of like realizing this was a lot of snow, but how do I compare it to other times? What is an important analysis that I can do as far as like breaking down how to show that this was a lot of snow, um, and kind of putting that context of saying like this was a lot. It was groundbreaking. It wasn't the most historic, but it was still a groundbreaking amount of snow. So I think trying to create a story um, with this data, with just the raw data, and really just putting it into context, kind of just trying to figure out how does this stack up against other times of Chicago history. So some strengths and weaknesses of the article as presented here. So we'll start with the strengths. That the visuals were actually very helpful for the article, I think. I think that they showed, kind of like put it into context, like I said, and I think this is just an important point to keep repeating, is that um, when comparing sort of like weather data, it's one thing to kind of like have it, to have weather data and like see what it is, but also, and then even then, like having weather data for a period of time, for like, say, for instance, like over the past century, it's like one thing to have all that data. It's another thing to be able to collect it, and I guess I'm saying putting into context. What I mean by that is being able to compare it and say like, okay, so like how is the weather usually? How does it compare to like other times? Is this historic at all? Is this like, are things changing at all? Um, and kind of just like how frequent is this happening, or how much is this like compared to the normal, and how much is compared to like when it does happen, how it happens, so like how does the snowfall kind of stack up against like other instances. both compared to the norm as well as to the outliers. So like if it's an outlier, kind of like does it happen in a similar fashion as the other ones, or it's kind of somewhat random. So I think they have a good understanding of that and kind of just being able to kind of put that into context. Now the weakness with this data or with this story is that it really doesn't do any analysis. It kind of just presents us, it contextualizes it. It does do a good job, like I said, of comparing of comparing using the visuals and the graphics of kind of just like this is how it stacks up to other historic times. Um, but other than that, there isn't really much work done with the story. The story itself is only like 3 or 4 paragraphs at most. Um, so they're they don't really seem to be presenting much more than just information that's like available to them. Um, I think that adding a bit more context and kind of just like comparing it to, like I said, the norms as well as like the kind of like the periods before and after this period would be very helpful. Um, so I have some ideas for this story. Firstly, kind of like comparing the snowfall before and after the 10 inches or more periods. I think going back to the graph earlier, this one, honestly, I think this might be the most helpful graph because I think that it really does give a story. It does give, like I said, a visual representation. You kind of feel or kind of like get an idea in one's mind of like this, of how much snow there was over this period of time. So I think kind of just like comparing the amount of snow like before and after these periods would be really important. Um, for example, like in 2001, 1979, 1918, or no, yeah, 1918, there was like kind of some snow before and after. It was kind of like leading up. It kind of led into, and then like then fell off of, or kind of like let out of. So it wasn't like a big. Granted, it was somewhat big spike, but like it wasn't like it was like a immediate jump from no snow. Um, although it does kind of seem like there was a big jump to no snow at the end of the period in 1918. But then one of the more interesting points, and this is a second idea, is looking at how much snow fell during this period. So kind of just like whether it was a constant kind of like flow of snow or if it was like in spurts. So I think an interesting point of this data is that in all the instances except for 2021, it seems like there was like kind of like peaks of when there was snowfall. So like in 1918, it seems like there's like 3 different peaks. Kind of like the first peak, which happened like at the first point where there was the 10 inches of snow, like the first peak, and then it peaks again a little bit closer to like the middle of January, and then it goes down a little bit to roughly like 15, 17 inches, and then it peaks again at the start of February. And so it seems like there's like a 3 peak kind of pattern going on here before it then falls off. Same thing happened in 1979, where there was kind of looks like a constant amount of snow around 9 inches, and then it ends up peaking close to 30 inches, just starting off from the 9 inches roughly. And then it goes down a little bit, and then it jumps back up, peaks again, close, not as high, but like a little bit. And then it goes down again, and then it peaks one more time near the end of February before it then starts tapering off towards March. Um, However, in 2021, you don't really see that. There is kind of a peak before February, but it's not like a huge peak compared to the others. Um, and it doesn't even take the snowfall above 10 inches. So then there's like a second peak, and this is the one that does take it over the 10-inch mark. But then it kind of just it keeps building as we're compared to the other ones. Like the third peak, it starts kind of falling off a little bit, starts tapering. Not compared to 2001, but in 1918, 1979, there's like a taper off at the third peak. Um, Whereas in 2021, it doesn't really seem to taper off. It kind of just kept building, and then it fell off at the end of it. So it kind of just falls down to like what looks like close to zero. Um, Granted, it's possibly not. It just might be like a trick of the eyes as compared to how it is, but it does look like it fell off quite a bit. And again, this was like after like kind of having like a big surge at the end, where it only really seems to have had like one peak, although it could be false. It could be the way that the data is presented. And then compared to 2001, um, 2001 also has those, it kind of has like that three peak pattern, which is the first peak to start off the period, the second peak, which is like the middle one, and the third one. However, it kind of lines up with the 2021 pattern where it peaked at the third peak, or what could seem to be a third peak for the 2021, and it tapers off later. But for that kind of goes against like the other examples where it was a smaller peak, where the third peak was a smaller peak, but in more recent times, 2021 and 2001, it was a peak in the third. The third one was the highest peak as opposed to the first one for the other two examples. So I think that could be an interesting analysis of like how the snowfall like lines up, kind of like when does it come in like spurts? Does it come in like a more constant form? So I think that could be interesting. It seems like it's been more spurt like, or kind of like in spikes in more recent instances, as opposed to the older instances. Um, and then the last idea is kind of just questioning whether or not it's becoming a more frequent phenomenon. Like take this graph, for example. You have the 1979, 1918, 2001, 2021, and 1885. 1885 is a long way off from like a lot of these dates. But it seems like there's only been 20 years. So it's been about 22 years between 1979 and 2001. And then it's 20 years between 2001 and 2021. Um, Possibly we need kind of more data to kind of look into just like the amount of time between instances like this, as well as kind of other sorts of snowfall stats, such as like the most amount of snow that's come down, or kind of just like the overall temperature and conditions that would make snow. Um, but it seems as if it might be growing more frequently. That's on like kind of like an initial thought. So these are just some story ideas as far as like this one goes, is how to improve it. Whether it's more or less frequent and so on and so forth. That this story, it has some interesting data, but I think that it could have been taken to another level. Even if you want to keep it local, kind of just like understanding kind of like whether or not this might be more frequent, and people should start adjusting. In Chicago, should start adjusting for this kind of weather. So even if you want to keep it like a local story, you can start talking about like those sorts of adjustments. Um, so yeah, these are the sources. The first link is the article. The second one is where I got the map over here on this slide. Um, and yeah, so this was my festival of data. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah.